A bear appears and blocks the entrance of a cabin for hours. The man, trapped with no way out, finally opens the door. What he finds is something no one could have ever imagined. The harsh winter wind whistled through the Colorado mountains as Professor Henry Lawson's truck wound its way up the narrow road. His knuckles were white against the steering wheel, not just from the cold, but from the weight of everything he was leaving behind. The bitter taste of his recent divorce still lingered, along with the whispers of colleagues about his declining academic career at the university. If this story caught your interest, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give it a like. Let us know which city you're watching us from. Stay tuned. The cabin appeared through the swirling snow like a mirage, a simple wooden structure that promised what Henry desperately needed: solitude. It stood nestled among towering pines, its windows dark and welcoming. As he pulled up to the front, he couldn't help but notice how the afternoon light caught the frost on the windows, creating patterns that seemed almost deliberate, like nature's own stained glass. Inside, the cabin smelled of cedar and thyme. Henry dropped his duffel bag on the wooden floor, watching dust motes dance in the beam of light from the partially curtained window. The furniture was sparse but sturdy: a worn leather armchair, a solid oak table, and bookshelves that lined one entire wall. It wasn't much, but it was exactly what he needed: a place far from the academic politics, the whispered conversations that stopped when he entered rooms, and the empty house that still held echoes of his failed marriage. "This is it," he muttered to himself, running a hand along the rough-hewn mantel of the stone fireplace. "This is where I start over." The words hung in the air, competing with the silence that seemed to pulse from the walls themselves. He began unpacking his supplies: enough food for several weeks, books he'd been meaning to read for years, and a leather-bound journal, still blank, waiting for whatever insights isolation might bring. As evening approached, Henry settled into a routine that would become familiar over the coming days. He stoked the fire, prepared a simple meal, and began writing in his journal. The scratching of his pen against paper was the only sound besides the occasional pop from the fireplace and the wind's haunting melody outside. That first night, sleep came easily, deeper than he'd experienced in months. The mountain air, thin and pure, seemed to cleanse not just his lungs but something deeper inside him. The darkness was absolute, unmarred by city lights or the glow of devices, and the silence wrapped around him like a thick blanket. But peace, as Henry would soon discover, can be deceptive. As he drifted off, somewhere in the distance, a branch snapped. The sound was sharp, deliberate, like something or someone testing the boundaries of his solitude. In his half-conscious state, Henry dismissed it as wildlife, unaware that this small disturbance was the first note in a symphony of mysteries that would soon envelop his mountain refuge. The next morning dawned crisp and clear. Henry spent hours exploring the immediate surroundings of the cabin, noting the way the sunlight filtered through the pine needles, creating shifting patterns on the snow-covered ground. He found himself breathing easier, his thoughts less cluttered. The academic papers that had been weighing him down seemed less important here, where the only judgment came from the wind and trees. Yet as he walked, something caught his attention. Near the edge of the clearing, where the maintained ground of the cabin gave way to wilderness, he noticed unusual depressions in the snow. They might have been animal tracks, but something about their spacing and shape made him pause. They were too large for any common wildlife, too deliberate in their placement. He followed them for a few yards before they disappeared into the thicker forest. That evening, as he sat by the fire with a book in his lap, Henry found his attention drawn repeatedly to the window. The darkness outside seemed to press against the glass, and more than once he caught himself staring at shadows that appeared to move just beyond the circle of light cast by his lamp. He told himself it was just his mind adjusting to the isolation, to being truly alone for the first time in years. But as he prepared for bed, he heard it again, the sound of breaking branches, closer this time, and something else, a heavy tread in the snow, methodical and purposeful. Henry stood in the middle of the cabin listening intently, his heart beating a rapid rhythm against his ribs. The footsteps circled the cabin once, twice, before fading into the night. Sleep came more reluctantly that night, and his dreams were filled with shadowy figures that watched from just beyond the firelight. As he tossed and turned, the wind seemed to carry whispers, and in the depths of night he could have sworn he heard his name carried on the breeze, soft but distinct, like a secret being shared by the mountain itself. The third night at the cabin brought a shift in Henry's mountain refuge. He jolted awake to the distinct sound of branches snapping outside, the noise sharp and clear in the pristine mountain air. His first instinct was to rationalize. Surely it was just the local wildlife, perhaps deer or elk moving through the underbrush, yet something about the rhythm of the sound suggested otherwise. As dawn broke the next morning, Henry found himself drawn to investigate. The morning light revealed tracks in the freshly fallen snow surrounding the cabin. These weren't the delicate impressions of deer or the padding of mountain lions. They were footprints, unmistakably human in shape but unnaturally large. The proportions were wrong, as if someone had deliberately created them to unsettle him. Inside the cabin, subtle changes began to manifest. A book he distinctly remembered leaving on the coffee table now sat slightly askew on the shelf. His coffee mug appeared on the windowsill when he was certain he'd left it by the sink. Each instance was small enough to doubt, yet the accumulation of these minor disruptions began to wear on his nerves. The days passed with an increasing sense of being watched. Henry tried to focus on his writing, on the peaceful solitude he'd sought, but his attention kept drifting to the windows, to the vast expanse of wilderness beyond. The forest seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something he couldn't quite grasp. One evening, as he sat reading by lamplight, the heavy sound of footsteps crunching in the snow drew him to the window. There, just beyond the pool of light spilling from the cabin, stood a massive black bear. The creature's presence was different from anything Henry had encountered in his previous wildlife experiences. It didn't display the typical cautious behavior of a bear investigating human territory. Instead, it stood perfectly still, its dark eyes fixed on him, with an intelligence that sent a shiver down his spine. The bear's appearance became a nightly occurrence, always maintaining the same calculated distance from the cabin. It never showed aggression, never attempted to come closer, but its steady observation felt purposeful, as if it were studying Henry just as much as he was studying it. Driven by a mix of curiosity and unease, Henry began exploring the cabin more thoroughly. The building's age showed in its worn floorboards and weathered walls, but it was the discovery in the attic that truly captured his attention. Hidden among dust-covered boxes and old furniture, he found a wooden sculpture of a bear. The craftsmanship was exquisite, but it was the strange inscriptions carved into its base that held him transfixed. The symbols were unlike anything he'd seen before, their meaning tantalizingly out of reach. Alongside the sculpture lay an aged map, its edges frayed and yellowed. Mysterious markings dotted its surface, all seeming to converge on a specific location in the surrounding mountains. The discovery sparked something in Henry, a scholar's curiosity that had laid dormant during his recent professional struggles. His investigation led him to uncover that the cabin had once belonged to Samuel Hayes, an anthropologist who had vanished decades ago. The name tugged at something in Henry's memory, a vague recollection of academic whispers about Hayes's unconventional theories and mysterious disappearance. The most intriguing discovery came in the form of a hidden compartment behind a loose panel in the attic wall. Inside, Henry found Hayes's journal, its pages filled with detailed accounts of encounters with a bear remarkably similar to the one now visiting his cabin. Hayes's writings referenced indigenous legends about mountain guardians, beings that straddled the line between the physical and spiritual worlds. As Henry read deeper into Hayes's journal, the bear's nightly visits took on new significance. The anthropologist's accounts suggested these weren't random encounters, but part of a larger pattern, a story written in the language of the mountains themselves. Hayes had documented similar experiences, objects moving inexplicably, strange sounds in the night, and most intriguingly, the constant presence of the bear. The journal entries became increasingly focused on local indigenous stories about guardian spirits that took the form of bears, appearing to those who needed guidance or protection. Hayes had been convinced these weren't mere legends, but truth wrapped in mythology, waiting to be understood by those willing to look beyond the surface. That night, as Henry sat with Hayes's journal spread before him, the bear appeared again. This time, when their eyes met through the window, Henry felt something shift in his understanding. The creature's gaze held more than animal intelligence. It carried the weight of something ancient and knowing, something that had drawn him to this remote cabin for reasons he was only beginning to comprehend. The mounting mystery of the cabin and its ursine visitor drove Henry to seek answers in the nearest town, a small settlement nestled in the valley below. The drive down the mountain road gave him time to organize his thoughts, to try to make sense of Hayes's journal entries and the strange events he'd witnessed. The rational part of his mind, the academic who'd built his career on empirical evidence, struggled against the inexplicable nature of his experiences. The town itself seemed frozen in time, with its main street lined with weather-worn buildings and locals who regarded newcomers with cautious curiosity. As Henry parked his truck outside the local diner, he noticed how conversations quieted when he entered, only to resume in hushed tones once he passed. It reminded him uncomfortably of the whispers that had followed him through university hallways in recent months. It was at the diner's counter that he met Linda Martinez. She approached him with the confident stride of someone who knew every face in town and had immediately recognized him as an outsider. Her dark eyes held a knowing look that made Henry wonder if she'd been expecting him. "You're staying up at the Hayes cabin, aren't you?" she asked, sliding onto the stool next to him. There was no surprise in her voice, just quiet certainty. When Henry confirmed this, she nodded as if pieces of a puzzle were falling into place. Linda introduced herself as a local guide, someone who knew the mountains as intimately as one might know their own home. But there was something in her manner, a careful way of choosing her words, that suggested she knew far more than she was willing to say outright. "The mountains have their own ways," she said, stirring her coffee thoughtfully, "their own guardians. The old stories talk about bears that appear in times of need, protectors some call them, but protection always comes with a price." She let the words hang in the air between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. Henry found himself sharing details about the bear's visits, the moving objects, the footprints. With each revelation, Linda's expression grew more intense, more focused. She listened without interruption, but her fingers traced patterns on the counter's surface, patterns that reminded Henry of the inscriptions on the wooden sculpture. "There are legends," she continued, her voice dropping to just above a whisper, "passed down through generations. They speak of spirits that take the form of bears, appearing to those who stand at crossroads in their lives. But these aren't just stories for tourists, Professor Lawson. They're warnings as much as they are guides." As they talked, other patrons of the diner seemed to give them a wide berth, as if aware of the weight of their conversation. Linda shared fragments of local history, stories of others who had encountered similar phenomena in the mountains, each account adding layers to the mystery surrounding Hayes's disappearance. "Samuel Hayes wasn't the first to seek answers in these mountains," Linda explained, "and he won't be the last. But you should know, once you start down this path, the mountains have their own way of deciding how far you go." Before Henry left, Linda pressed a small leather-bound book into his hands. "This belonged to my grandmother," she said. "It contains some of the old stories, things that aren't written in any academic text. Read it carefully, Professor. Sometimes the answers we seek aren't in the questions we're asking." The drive back to the cabin gave Henry time to process Linda's words. The book she'd given him sat on the passenger seat, seeming to pulse with potential answers. As he navigated the winding mountain road, the setting sun cast long shadows through the trees, and for a moment he could have sworn he saw a large, dark figure moving parallel to his truck, keeping pace just beyond the tree line. That evening, as he settled in to read Linda's book, the bear made its usual appearance outside the cabin, but this time something was different. The creature's presence felt less like observation and more like anticipation, as if it too was waiting for Henry to uncover the next piece of the puzzle. The book's pages were filled with handwritten accounts of encounters with mountain spirits, detailed drawings of symbols that matched those on the wooden sculpture, and descriptions of ancient rituals meant to commune with the forest's guardians. Each page seemed to lead Henry deeper into a world where the line between reality and legend blurred, where the rational explanations he'd relied on throughout his academic career began to feel insufficient. As night fell and the wind picked up outside, Henry found himself increasingly absorbed in the stories. The more he read, the more he began to understand that his presence in the cabin wasn't mere coincidence. The mountains had called to him in his moment of crisis, just as they had called to others before him. The bear's appearances, the strange occurrences. They weren't meant to frighten him, but to guide him towards something he was only beginning to comprehend. The weather in the mountains changed with frightening speed. What began as a light snowfall rapidly transformed into a fierce blizzard, trapping Henry in the cabin with his thoughts and his growing collection of mysteries. The wind howled through the trees, creating an eerie chorus that seemed to carry whispers just beyond comprehension. As the storm intensified, Henry sat in Hayes's old armchair, Linda's book open on his lap, studying the intricate drawings of symbols that matched those on the wooden bear sculpture. The blizzard had knocked out the power, leaving him in the flickering light of the fireplace and a few carefully placed candles. The dancing shadows on the walls seemed to bring the cabin's secrets to life. Then he heard it. His name carried on the wind, clear as a bell despite the storm's fury. At first, Henry dismissed it as a trick of the weather, the wind playing games with his imagination. But it came again, more distinct this time, accompanied by soft, deliberate knocks on the cabin door. "Henry." The voice was neither male nor female, neither young nor old, but it carried an authority that made his spine tingle. The knocking continued, gentle but insistent, like a visitor who knew they were expected. For long moments, he remained frozen in his chair, the book forgotten in his lap. The rational part of his mind argued against answering. Who could possibly be out in such weather? But something deeper, more instinctive, told him this was important. This was why he was here. When he finally found the courage to approach the door, the knocking stopped. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for the handle, but when he pulled it open, he found only the swirling snow and darkness. Yet there, half buried in the fresh powder on the doorstep, something caught the candlelight from inside. A key. It was an old brass key, its surface etched with the same symbol he'd seen on the wooden bear sculpture. The metal was cold in his palm, but it seemed to warm quickly, as if responding to his touch. Henry stood in the doorway, scanning the darkness, but the storm had swallowed any traces of his mysterious visitor. Back inside, he examined the key more closely. The craftsmanship was exquisite, the symbol carved with precise detail that spoke of significance beyond mere decoration. As he turned it over in his hands, something clicked in his memory. A detail from Hayes's journal about a hidden compartment that contained crucial information about the mountain's secrets. The storm continued to rage outside as Henry began a methodical search of the cabin. The key had to fit something, and whatever it unlocked, he sensed it would lead him deeper into the mystery that seemed to have chosen him as its witness. In his search, he discovered that certain floorboards, when struck just right, produced hollow sounds. Behind particular panels, the walls seemed to hold secrets. The cabin, he realized, was like a puzzle box, designed to protect its mysteries, until the right person came along with the right key. As midnight approached, the bear made its appearance despite the storm. Through the snow-streaked windows, Henry could see its massive form, standing like a sentinel in the swirling white. But tonight was different. The creature seemed more alert, its attention focused not on Henry but on something else out in the darkness. The key finally found its lock behind a loose panel near the fireplace. The compartment it revealed contained more of Hayes's writings, but these were different from the journal entries Henry had found before. These pages spoke of an ancient altar, a place where the physical and spiritual worlds drew close enough to touch. Hayes had documented its location, along with warnings about the responsibilities that came with such knowledge. Among the papers, Henry found detailed descriptions of rituals and ceremonies, carefully recorded observations of inexplicable phenomena, and references to a deeper purpose behind the bear's appearances. Hayes hadn't been just studying these occurrences. He had been preparing for something that required both courage and understanding. The storm's intensity seemed to respond to each new discovery. As Henry read through Hayes's hidden documents, the wind's voice grew more distinct, no longer just carrying his name, but fragments of phrases in a language he didn't recognize but somehow understood in his bones. Outside, the bear remained at its post, now joined by other shadows that moved at the edge of visibility. Through the storm's curtain of white, Henry caught glimpses of shapes that seemed to defy natural explanation, as if the boundary between the physical world and something else had begun to thin. The night deepened, and with each passing hour, Henry felt himself drawing closer to understanding why he had been drawn to this place. The key in his hand was more than just a means to unlock a hidden compartment. It was an invitation to step beyond the boundaries of his previous understanding, to acknowledge that some truths couldn't be contained within the comfortable confines of academic theory. As the storm subsided, the mountain world emerged transformed, draped in fresh snow that glittered under the pale morning light. Henry stepped out onto the cabin's porch, Hayes's secret document still weighing heavily on his mind. The air was crisp and clean, but something felt different, the silence too complete, the stillness too deliberate. His attention was drawn to a set of fresh tracks in the snow, distinctly human and definitely not his own. These weren't the mysterious, large footprints from before. These were recent, purposeful, and led in a clear direction through the trees. Following them with his eyes, Henry noticed something that made his heart skip. The faint wisp of smoke rising above the tree line, perhaps a quarter-mile away. Someone had set up camp nearby, and based on the track's pattern, they'd been circling the cabin, watching. The thought sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the mountain air. Whoever this person was, they seemed to be tracking the same phenomena that had captured Henry's attention. With careful steps, Henry followed the tracks to their camp. He kept his distance, using the trees for cover, and what he found confirmed his suspicions. The camp was professional-grade expedition equipment, high-end tent, sophisticated tracking gear, and most tellingly, cameras set up facing in the direction where the bear usually appeared. On a tree near the camp, Henry spotted something that made his blood run cold, a detailed map of the area, marked with the same symbols he'd found in Hayes's documents. This wasn't a coincidence. The stranger was pursuing the same mysteries, but something about the setup suggested their intentions were far from academic curiosity. As he carefully retreated from the campsite, Henry caught movement in his peripheral vision, a figure moving through the trees with the practiced ease of someone used to mountain terrain. He quickened his pace back to the cabin, mind racing with questions about this new player in the unfolding mystery. Inside the relative safety of the cabin, Henry spread out Hayes's documents alongside Linda's book. Cross-referencing the materials, he began to see a pattern emerging. The symbols, the bear's appearances, the hidden altar, they were all connected to what Hayes had described as a convergence point, a place where ancient powers still held sway. The afternoon light was fading when Henry heard footsteps on the porch. These weren't the heavy treads of the bear, but the deliberate steps of someone who wanted to be heard. A knock followed, 3 sharp raps that echoed through the cabin. Henry opened the door to find a man dressed in expedition gear, his weathered face wearing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He introduced himself as a wildlife photographer, but everything about him, from his carefully chosen words to his too keen interest in Henry's research, suggested otherwise. The conversation that followed was a careful dance of questions and evasions. The stranger seemed particularly interested in the wooden bear sculpture, his eyes repeatedly drawn to it as they spoke. He asked about Henry's experiences with the local wildlife, about any unusual phenomena he might have witnessed, each question laden with unspoken meaning. As they talked, Henry became increasingly aware of movement in the forest beyond the cabin's windows. The bear was out there. He could feel its presence, watching this interaction with what felt like protective interest. The stranger must have sensed it too, his posture becoming more tense, his attention divided between Henry and the gathering shadows outside. Before leaving, the man made what seemed like a casual offer to share his extensive research on local wildlife, but his emphasis on certain words made it clear he knew about Hayes's work and the mysteries surrounding the cabin. It wasn't an offer of collaboration, it was a veiled demand for information. That evening, after the stranger had gone, Henry noticed the bear's behavior had changed. Instead of maintaining its usual distance, it moved closer to the cabin than ever before. Its presence felt less like observation and more like protection, as if it understood the new tension that had entered their shared story. As night fell, Henry began to understand that he wasn't just an observer of these events, he had become part of them. The stranger's appearance had shifted something fundamental in the dynamic between him, the cabin, and its ursine guardian. What had begun as a retreat from his troubled life had become something far more significant, and he sensed that soon he would have to choose a side in a conflict he was only beginning to comprehend. Armed with Hayes's map and the ancient symbols from his research, Henry decided it was time to follow the trail that had been calling to him. The morning light cast long shadows through the trees as he prepared for his expedition, carefully packing Hayes's documents, Linda's book, and essential supplies. The weight of the wooden bear sculpture in his backpack served as a constant reminder of the mysteries he was pursuing. The path led him deeper into the mountain wilderness than he'd ventured before. The terrain became increasingly challenging, with rock formations that seemed to guide his way like ancient sentinels. As he walked, he couldn't shake the feeling that the forest itself was watching, evaluating his every step. After several hours of hiking, Henry came upon a formation that matched the markings on Hayes's map. Hidden behind a curtain of vines and decades of natural camouflage, he discovered the entrance to a tunnel. The opening was architectural rather than natural, its edges too precise to have been shaped by time and weather alone. The entrance bore symbols identical to those on the wooden bear sculpture, carved with remarkable precision into the living rock. They seemed to pulse with a faint luminescence that Henry first attributed to tricks of the light, until he realized the tunnel was too deep for natural light to penetrate that far. Inside, the air was surprisingly warm and dry. Henry's flashlight beam revealed more symbols etched into the walls, creating patterns that seemed to tell a story. The drawings depicted bears that walked like men, humans who transformed into animals, and sacred ceremonies performed under star-filled skies. Each image led to the next, all pointing deeper into the mountain's heart. As he progressed, Henry noticed that the tunnel wasn't simply a passage. It was a carefully designed path. The symbols became more complex, more numerous, all seemingly leading towards something significant. The air grew thicker, with an energy he couldn't explain but could definitely feel, like static electricity before a storm. Halfway through the tunnel, Henry's flashlight began to flicker, its beam growing weaker until it finally died. But instead of being plunged into darkness, he found the tunnel was dimly illuminated by the symbols themselves, now glowing with an unmistakable blue-white light. The rational part of his mind struggled to explain this phenomenon, while something deeper within him accepted it as part of the mountain's mystery. The tunnel opened into a larger chamber, where the carved symbols converged into intricate mandalas on the ceiling and floor. At the center of the room stood a stone pedestal, its surface marked with a depression that seemed perfectly sized for the wooden bear sculpture he carried. As Henry studied the chamber, he became aware of a presence watching him. It wasn't threatening, but it carried a weight of age and wisdom that made him feel like a child taking his first steps into an adult world. The air seemed to thicken with anticipation, as if the very mountain was holding its breath. From somewhere deeper in the tunnel came the sound of footsteps, human footsteps. The stranger had followed him. Henry quickly concealed himself behind a column, watching as a beam of light danced along the tunnel walls. The footsteps grew closer, accompanied by the soft clicking of what sounded like photography equipment. The chamber's mysterious illumination dimmed as the stranger approached, as if the mountain itself was withdrawing from the intrusion. Henry remained hidden, watching as the man methodically photographed the symbols and consulted what appeared to be a well-worn copy of similar documents to Hayes's. Through the chamber's entrance, beyond the stranger's flashlight beam, Henry caught a glimpse of movement, a massive, dark shape moving with impossible silence. The bear had followed them both, its presence now feeling less like an observer and more like a guardian preparing to intervene. The stranger must have sensed something too, because he suddenly stopped his documentation and stood perfectly still, his flashlight beam frozen on the wall. The atmosphere in the chamber changed, becoming charged with an energy that made the glowing symbols pulse more intensely. Henry felt caught between two forces, the stranger's determined pursuit of the mountain's secrets and the bear's ancient protective presence. In that moment, he understood that he wasn't just a witness to these events. He was a participant in something that had been set in motion long before he arrived at the cabin. The chamber seemed to be waiting for a decision, for an action that would tip the balance one way or another. The wooden bear sculpture in Henry's backpack felt warm, almost alive, as if responding to the energy building in the ancient space. Whatever was about to happen, Henry sensed it would change not just his understanding of the mountain's mysteries, but his entire perception of reality itself. In the ancient chamber, Time seemed to stand still as Henry watched the stranger methodically document the sacred symbols. The man's movements were precise, professional, but there was something predatory in his efficiency. This wasn't documentation for preservation, but for exploitation. Finally, the stranger spoke without turning around, his voice echoing off the chamber walls. "I know you're here, Professor Lawson. We might as well speak face to face." His tone was casual, but it carried an edge of steel beneath the courtesy. Henry stepped out from behind the column, his heart pounding, but his voice steady. "Who are you really?" he asked, though he already suspected this was no ordinary explorer. The man turned, his camera still in hand. "Marcus Reed," he said, offering a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I collect specialized artifacts, items of particular cultural and spiritual significance." He gestured to the symbols around them. "This place? It's more than just ancient art. It's a key to something far more valuable." Reed's attention fixed on Henry's backpack, where the wooden bear sculpture was concealed. "Hayes was close to understanding it all," he continued. "His research combined with these symbols and that sculpture you're carrying, they're pieces of a puzzle I've spent years trying to solve." "These aren't artifacts for collection," Henry replied, feeling the weight of Hayes's journal entries and Linda's warnings. "They're part of something living, something that still has power." Reed's smile widened, but his eyes grew colder. "That's precisely what makes them so valuable, Professor. Do you have any idea what collectors would pay for genuine artifacts of power? This isn't just about preservation, it's about possession." As they talked, the chamber's mysterious illumination began to pulse, the symbols glowing brighter and then dimmer in a rhythm that felt almost like breathing. The air grew thick with tension, and Henry could sense the bear's presence growing stronger, though it remained hidden in the shadows. "The map," Reed demanded, taking a step forward. "Hayes's complete research, I know you have them. Hand them over and we can both walk away from this with what we want." His hand slipped inside his jacket, suggesting he was prepared to take more forceful measures. But before either man could move, a deep rumble echoed through the chamber. The bear emerged from the shadows, its massive form somehow more imposing in the ethereal light of the glowing symbols. It moved with deliberate grace, positioning itself between Henry and Reed. The stranger's composure cracked for the first time. "This is impossible," he whispered, his hand trembling as he reached for what Henry now saw was a tranquilizer gun. The legends. They were just stories. The bear's presence filled the chamber with an energy that made the glowing symbols pulse more intensely. Its eyes, fixed on Reed, held an intelligence that transcended mere animal awareness. In that moment, Henry understood what Hayes had discovered. This creature wasn't just a bear, but a manifestation of something far more ancient and powerful. Reed raised his weapon, but the bear moved with impossible speed. With one sweep of its massive paw, it sent the gun clattering across the chamber floor. The message was clear. This sacred space would not be violated by violence. Henry felt the wooden sculpture in his backpack grow warm, almost humming with energy. The bear turned its gaze to him, and in that look he saw not just intelligence but purpose. This wasn't a random encounter. He had been chosen, guided to this moment for reasons that were only now beginning to become clear. "Leave," Henry said to Reed, his voice carrying an authority that surprised even him. "Whatever you came here to take, it's not yours to possess." The bear's presence seemed to amplify his words, filling the chamber with a palpable force. Reed backed away, his mask of confidence completely shattered. "This isn't over," he warned, but his voice lacked conviction. "There are other ways to acquire what I want." He retreated into the tunnel, his flashlight beam dancing erratically on the walls as he hurried away. Left alone with the bear, Henry felt a profound shift in the chamber's energy. The symbols glowed more softly now, their light warm and welcoming. The bear moved closer, its presence no longer intimidating but protective. In its eyes, Henry saw a reflection of the mountain's ancient wisdom, and he knew that his journey had only just begun. Following the confrontation with Reed, the bear led Henry deeper into the mountain's heart. The tunnel widened into a series of chambers, each one more elaborate than the last, their walls covered in luminescent symbols that seemed to respond to their passage. The wooden sculpture in Henry's backpack grew warmer with each step, as if awakening to its proximity to something powerful. The final chamber took his breath away. It was a vast, circular space, its domed ceiling adorned with constellations rendered in the same ghostly blue light as the symbols. At its center stood the altar Hayes had described in his hidden documents, a masterpiece of ancient stonework that seemed to pulse with its own inner light. The altar's surface was carved with intricate patterns that matched both the wooden sculpture and the symbols throughout the tunnel. At its center was a depression that seemed to call to the sculpture Henry carried. The bear took up position at the chamber's entrance, as if standing guard against any further intrusions. As Henry approached the altar, the air grew thick with energy. The constellation patterns above began to shift and dance, casting moving shadows that took the forms of bears, wolves, and eagles. The mountain itself seemed to be awakening, responding to his presence in ways that defied rational explanation. With trembling hands, Henry removed the wooden sculpture from his backpack. It was warm to the touch now, vibrating with an energy that made his fingers tingle. Following an instinct he couldn't explain, he placed it in the depression at the altar's center. The fit was perfect, as if the sculpture and altar had been crafted as two parts of a single whole. The moment the sculpture settled into place, the chamber transformed. The glowing symbols brightened intensely, and the air filled with what seemed like whispers in an ancient tongue. Through the bear's eyes, which now shone with an inner light, Henry began to see visions, glimpses of the mountain's history, of ceremonies performed in this very chamber centuries ago. He saw indigenous elders communing with spirit animals, witnessed the passing of sacred knowledge from one generation to the next. He saw Hayes too, standing where Henry now stood, receiving similar visions, but vanishing before he could complete whatever task he had been chosen for. The visions shifted to show Henry his own journey, his arrival at the cabin, the bear's appearances, the discovery of Hayes's research. But now he saw these events from a different perspective. His presence here wasn't random. He had been called, chosen to continue a legacy that Hayes had left unfinished. Through the visions, Henry understood that the mountain was more than just a geographical feature. It was a nexus of natural and spiritual energy, a place where the barriers between worlds grew thin. The bear was its guardian, and those who came here were chosen for a purpose, to protect this sacred space and its ancient wisdom from those who would exploit it. The wooden sculpture began to rotate slowly on its own, each turn revealing new patterns in the altar's surface. The whispers grew clearer, and Henry found he could understand them, not with his ears but with something deeper, more primal. They spoke of balance, of the need for guardians who could bridge the gap between the modern world and ancient wisdom. In that moment, Henry saw his own life with stunning clarity. His academic struggles, his failed marriage, they hadn't been failures but preparation, stripping away everything that might have prevented him from accepting what he now witnessed. The bear had chosen him because he was ready to see beyond the boundaries of his rational academic world. The constellation patterns above shifted again, forming new configurations that spoke of future events. Henry saw himself continuing Hayes's work, but with a crucial difference. Where Hayes had sought to document these mysteries, Henry was meant to become part of them, to serve as a bridge between two worlds. The bear approached the altar, its massive form somehow in perfect harmony with the sacred space. As it stood beside Henry, he felt a connection forming, not the master and beast relationship he might have once imagined, but a partnership between equals, each with their own role in protecting the mountain's secrets. The chamber's energy began to settle into a steady pulse, like a heartbeat echoing through the stone. The wooden sculpture ceased its rotation, coming to rest in a position that felt somehow final, complete. The whispers faded, but their message remained clear in Henry's mind. He had found his true purpose, one that transcended his former life's ambitious but ultimately hollow pursuits. Looking into the bear's eyes, Henry saw not just ancient wisdom, but a reflection of his own potential, the person he could become if he accepted this new path. The choice before him was momentous, but in his heart, he knew it had already been made the moment he first arrived at the cabin. The journey back to the cabin was different from any walk Henry had ever experienced. The forest seemed alive in new ways, every rustle of leaves and snap of twig carrying meaning. The bear walked beside him, no longer a mysterious presence but a companion sharing in a sacred trust. Inside the cabin, everything appeared exactly as he'd left it, yet somehow transformed by his new understanding. Hayes's journal entries, scattered across the desk, now read less like the observations of an academic and more like the field notes of a fellow initiate. The symbols that had once seemed mysterious now felt like a familiar language, one that spoke of responsibilities and ancient truths. As evening approached, Henry began organizing Hayes's research with new purpose. The anthropologist's disappearance years ago took on new significance. Hayes hadn't vanished, Henry realized, but had chosen to step fully into the role of guardian, leaving behind his old identity to protect the mountain's secrets. The bear took up its usual position outside, but now Henry understood its presence differently. Through the window, he could see its eyes gleaming with that same inner light he'd witnessed in the chamber. The creature was more than a guardian. It was a bridge between worlds, just as he was now meant to be. Linda's book of local legends, which he'd placed on the shelf, seemed to call to him. Opening it again, he found passages that suddenly held new meaning. What he had initially read as mythological metaphors now revealed themselves as coded instructions, passing down sacred knowledge through generations of those chosen to protect the mountain's power. As night fell, the cabin filled with a gentle humming energy, similar to what he'd felt in the chamber, but more subdued, more intimate. Objects that had mysteriously moved during his early days here now seemed to respond to his presence intentionally, as if the cabin itself was acknowledging his new role. Henry began writing in his journal, but this time not as an academic documenting phenomena. His words flowed with the weight of personal transformation, recording not just what he'd witnessed but what he'd become. The pages filled with insights about the delicate balance between the modern world and ancient powers, and his emerging role in maintaining that balance. The wooden sculpture, returned to its place on the mantel, caught the firelight in ways that made the carved symbols dance. Henry noticed how its shadows shifted to match the patterns of moonlight streaming through the windows, creating ephemeral designs that matched the altar's ancient markings. Outside, other creatures began to gather: wolves, eagles, even a few deer, all keeping a respectful distance but clearly drawn to the energy emanating from the cabin. The bear acknowledged their presence with subtle movements, orchestrating what Henry now recognized as an age-old communion between the mountain's various guardians. His phone, which had been silent for days, suddenly chimed with messages from his university colleagues. They seemed to belong to another lifetime, concerns about department politics and publication deadlines that now felt trivially small compared to the truths he'd discovered. As midnight approached, Henry felt a subtle shift in the cabin's energy. The bear's presence outside grew stronger, and the symbols throughout the space began to glow with the same ethereal light he'd seen in the chamber. The boundary between the ordinary world and the mountain's mysteries grew thin, revealing glimpses of the sacred reality that had always existed alongside the mundane. Through the window, Henry watched as moonlight transformed the landscape. The forest was alive with shallow movements and subtle energies he would have missed just days ago. Every shadow held meaning. Every rustle of wind carried messages from the mountain's depths. In this moment of quiet revelation, Henry understood that his role as guardian would require more than just protecting physical spaces. He would need to become a keeper of knowledge, a preserver of ancient wisdom in a world that increasingly dismissed such things as mere superstition. The bear turned its gaze to him, and in its eyes Henry saw approval. He had passed some unspoken test, proven himself worthy of the trust placed in him. The mountain had called to him in his moment of crisis, offering not an escape from his troubles, but a path to something far more meaningful. The following days brought a profound shift in Henry's relationship with the cabin and its surroundings. Each morning began with a ritual he'd learned from Hayes's notes, now illuminated by his deeper understanding. He would stand at the cabin's threshold at dawn, acknowledging the sacred bond between guardian and mountain, while the bear maintained its vigilant presence nearby. The symbols throughout the cabin had begun responding to his touch, glowing faintly whenever he traced their patterns. What once seemed like random markings now revealed themselves as a complex language of protection and power, each one contributing to the cabin's role as a nexus of ancient energies. Linda arrived unannounced one morning, her expression knowing as she took in the changes in both the cabin and its occupant. "You've seen it, haven't you?" she asked, though it wasn't really a question. "The altar. the true purpose of this place. Her eyes held a mixture of relief and understanding. Hayes wasn't the first, she explained, settling into the old armchair. My grandmother's stories spoke of many guardians through the generations. Some were chosen from local families, others called from far away. Each brought their own strengths to the role. She studied Henry's face carefully. But few have formed such a strong bond with the bear spirit so quickly. As they talked, Henry shared his experiences at the altar, the visions he'd received, and his growing understanding of his new purpose. Linda listened intently, occasionally nodding as if confirming long-held suspicions. The bear, visible through the window, seemed to approve of their conversation, its presence a silent affirmation of the truth they shared. "The mountain chooses its guardians carefully," Linda continued, pulling an ancient leather pouch from her bag. "This belonged to my grandmother. She said it would be needed when the next true guardian appeared." Inside the pouch, Henry found a collection of small carved stones, each bearing symbols that matched those in the chamber. Teaching Henry to use the stones, Linda revealed another layer of his responsibility. They weren't just protective talismans, but keys to understanding the mountain's messages. When arranged in specific patterns, they could help interpret the signs and omens that the mountain provided. As the day progressed, Linda shared more of her family's knowledge, filling in gaps that even Hayes's research hadn't covered. The bear, she explained, wasn't just a guardian but a bridge between the physical and spiritual aspects of the mountain. Its presence in Henry's life was both a blessing and a responsibility. "The mountain's power isn't just about protecting secrets," she said, arranging the stones in a pattern that made them hum with energy. "It's about maintaining balance. The modern world pushes against these ancient places, trying to strip them of their mystery. Our role is to ensure that some things remain sacred." Through the window, they could see other animals gathering in the clearing, wolves, eagles, even a few deer. Linda explained that these creatures were all part of the mountain's consciousness, each species playing its role in the complex web of protection and power that centered on the cabin. As evening approached, Linda prepared to leave, but not before sharing one final piece of wisdom. "The hardest part," she said, gathering her things, "isn't learning the mysteries. It's learning to live between two worlds. You'll need to find a way to honor both your old life and your new purpose." The bear accompanied Linda to her car, an escort that she acknowledged with a respectful nod. As she drove away, Henry felt the weight of his new responsibility settling more comfortably on his shoulders. The academic life he'd left behind now seemed like preparation for this greater purpose. That night, alone in the cabin but more connected than ever to the mountain's energy, Henry began to truly understand the transformation he was undergoing. The symbols on the walls pulsed with life, responding to his growing awareness. The wooden sculpture on the mantel seemed to glow from within, its carvings shifting in the firelight like living things. The mountain began speaking to Henry in new ways, its messages becoming clearer with each passing day. The wind carried whispers of ancient wisdom, while the changing patterns of light through the cabin windows formed symbols that matched those in Hayes's documents. Even the daily movements of animals around the property had taken on new significance, each creature playing its part in the mountain's complex communication. Using Linda's carved stones and the knowledge he'd gained from the altar chamber, Henry started decoding these messages. He learned that the mountain's warnings could come in many forms, from the sudden flight of birds to the unexpected silence of the forest. The bear remained his most direct connection, its presence now a constant reminder of the sacred trust he'd inherited. One morning, while arranging the stones in a pattern Linda had taught him, Henry received a vision more vivid than any before. He saw the mountain as it had been centuries ago, watched as generation after generation of guardians maintained their vigil. Each had faced their own challenges, their own versions of men like Reed, who sought to exploit the mountain's power. The vision showed him more about Hayes as well. The anthropologist hadn't disappeared as most believed. He had transcended, becoming one with the mountain's consciousness in a way that few guardians ever achieved. His physical form might have vanished, but his essence remained, part of the very energy that now flowed through the cabin's walls. Working with the stones became a daily ritual, each session revealing new aspects of his role. The bear would often sit outside the window during these moments, its eyes reflecting the same ethereal light that emanated from the carved symbols. Together, they were learning to interpret the mountain's needs, to understand when and how to act as its protectors. The cabin itself seemed to respond to Henry's growing awareness. Objects no longer moved mysteriously. Instead, they shifted with purpose, often directing his attention to specific documents or symbols when the mountain had something urgent to communicate. The wooden sculpture on the mantel had become a focal point, its carvings sometimes rearranging themselves to form new messages. During one particularly intense session with the stones, Henry received a warning. The patterns revealed that Reed hadn't given up his pursuit of the mountain's secrets. The explorer was gathering resources, preparing to return with equipment and possibly others who shared his desire to exploit the sacred site. The bear's behavior confirmed these warnings. It had begun patrolling a wider area around the cabin, sometimes returning with evidence of unwelcome visitors, discarded equipment, marking tape, signs that others were probing the mountain's defenses. Each discovery added urgency to Henry's preparation for the conflict he knew was coming. Linda visited more frequently now, bringing additional teachings and helping Henry strengthen his connection to the mountain's power. She taught him how to read the weather patterns, showing him how natural phenomena could be both messages and tools in a guardian's arsenal. The mountain doesn't just need protection, she explained during one visit, it needs understanding. Each guardian brings their own gifts to this role. Your academic background, your ability to connect different pieces of knowledge, these aren't accidents. They're part of why you were chosen. Through his growing bond with the bear, Henry began to access memories stored within the mountain itself. He saw how the land had changed over centuries, witnessed the ceremonies and battles that had shaped its sacred nature. These visions weren't just history lessons, they were preparation for his own role in the mountain's ongoing story. The significance of the altar chamber became clearer with each new revelation. It wasn't just a place of power. It was a nexus point where the physical and spiritual aspects of the mountain converged. Understanding how to properly use this space would be crucial in the coming confrontation with those who sought to exploit it. As his knowledge deepened, Henry found himself changing in subtle but profound ways. His senses had sharpened, allowing him to perceive energies and intentions that would have once seemed impossible to detect. The academic skepticism that had once defined his worldview had been replaced by a deeper understanding of truth, one that encompassed both the rationale and the mystical. The bear, sensing these changes, began sharing more of its own wisdom. Through their strengthening bond, Henry learned that the creature was far more than a simple guardian. It was a living embodiment of the mountain's consciousness, a bridge between the ancient powers and those chosen to protect them. The atmosphere around the cabin grew heavy with anticipation as nature itself seemed to sense the approaching conflict. Henry had spent weeks strengthening his connection to the mountain's power, learning to channel its energy through the ancient symbols and sacred stones. The bear's presence had become more pronounced, its protective instincts heightened by the growing tension. Through his daily communion with the stones Linda had given him, Henry received increasingly urgent messages. The patterns they formed spoke of multiple intruders approaching from different directions, all drawn by Reed's promises of power and profit. The mountain was showing him visions of their preparations, sophisticated equipment being assembled, maps being marked, plans being made to breach the sacred spaces. Linda arrived one morning with news from the town. "They're gathering at the old lodge," she reported, her usually calm voice tight with concern. "Reed has convinced some wealthy collectors that he's found something unprecedented in these mountains. They're funding his expedition, but they have no idea what forces they're really dealing with." The bear paced the cabin's perimeter as they talked, its massive form radiating an energy that made the symbols on the walls pulse with answering light. Through their deepened connection, Henry could sense its growing determination to protect not just the physical space, but the delicate balance between worlds that centered on the mountain. Henry spent hours studying Hayes's final journal entries with new understanding. What had once seemed like the ramblings of an obsessed academic now revealed themselves as carefully coded instructions. Hayes had foreseen this moment, had prepared the way for his successor to face this very challenge. "The mountain chooses its moments carefully," Linda explained, helping Henry arrange the stones in a protective pattern. "This confrontation isn't just about stopping Reed. It's about establishing the strength of its new guardian. about showing that its ancient powers are still vital and protected in the modern world. The wooden sculpture on the mantel had begun emanating a constant subtle warmth, its carved symbols shifting and changing like living things. Henry understood now that it wasn't just a representation of the bear, but a key to accessing the mountain's deeper powers. When placed on the altar, it would serve as a focal point for the energies he was learning to channel. As evening approached, the forest around the cabin grew unusually quiet. The regular sounds of wildlife were replaced by a watchful silence, as if every creature was holding its breath. Through his enhanced senses, Henry could feel the mountain gathering its strength, preparing for what was to come. That night, as he sat with the bear under a star-filled sky, Henry reflected on how far he had come from the disillusioned academic who had first sought refuge in this cabin. His failed marriage, his professional struggles, all of it had been preparation, stripping away the layers of his old life to make room for this new purpose. The bear's eyes, reflecting the starlight, held ancient wisdom and fierce determination. Through their bond, Henry understood that the coming conflict would test not just his newfound abilities, but his commitment to the sacred trust he had inherited. The mountain had chosen him for this moment, had guided him through his transformation for this very purpose. Linda's stones, arranged in a protective circle around the cabin, hummed with energy. Each one had been carefully placed according to the patterns revealed in Henry's visions, creating a network of power that connected to the larger energies of the mountain. The symbols on the cabin walls responded to this energy, their soft glow providing both light and reassurance. As midnight approached, Henry received a clear vision through his connection with the bear. He saw Reed and his team making final preparations, their equipment loaded and ready. But he also saw something they couldn't: the mountain's awareness of their plans, its readiness to defend its secrets through its chosen guardian. The wooden sculpture began to pulse more intensely, its rhythmic energy matching the beating of Henry's heart. Through it, he could feel the mountain's power gathering, concentrating around the cabin and the sacred spaces it protected. The time for preparation was coming to an end. Soon he would have to stand as the guardian he had become. In these quiet hours before the storm, Henry found a deep sense of peace beneath the tension. He was no longer searching for his place in the world. He had found it here, between the ancient and the modern, protecting truths that needed to remain sacred. Whatever challenges the dawn might bring, he would face them with the mountain's power flowing through him and the bear's wisdom guiding his path. Dawn broke over the mountain with an otherworldly stillness. The usual chorus of morning birdsong was absent, replaced by an expectant hush that seemed to hold the entire forest in its grip. Henry stood on the cabin's porch, the wooden sculpture cradled in his hands, its warmth pulsing in rhythm with the energy flowing through the sacred ground. The bear appeared from the shadows of the trees, moving with deliberate purpose. Through their connection, Henry could sense its heightened awareness of every sound, every movement in their sanctuary. Linda's protective stones, arranged in precise patterns around the cabin, hummed with increasing intensity as the morning light touched them. They didn't have to wait long. The first signs of intrusion came with the distant sound of vehicles approaching along the old forest road. Through his enhanced senses, Henry could feel Reed's presence among them, the man's determination burning like a cold fire against the mountain's ancient awareness. The bear's reaction was immediate, but controlled. It moved to a position that would remain hidden from immediate view, while allowing it to observe the approaching threat. Henry felt its strategy through their bond. They would let Reed reveal his full plan before responding. Reed's team arrived with military precision, their vehicles carrying equipment that spoke of serious intent. Henry watched from the cabin as they began unloading their gear, not just the tools of archaeologists and collectors, but devices designed to measure and potentially harness energy. They had come prepared to take more than just physical artifacts. "Professor Lawson," Reed's voice carried across the clearing, confident but with an edge of caution. "I see you've made yourself quite at home here, but surely a man of science like yourself can appreciate the importance of properly documenting and studying this site's unique properties." Henry stepped onto the porch, the wooden sculpture now warming intensely in his hands. The symbols carved into the cabin's exterior began to glow faintly, responding to the mounting tension. Through his connection to the mountain, he could feel its power gathering, ready to be channeled through its chosen guardian. "This place isn't meant for documentation or study," Henry replied, his voice carrying an authority that surprised even him. "Its power isn't meant to be measured or contained. The mountain chooses its guardians for a reason, Reed. This is your last chance to leave peacefully." Reed's response was to signal his team to continue unpacking their equipment. They began setting up a perimeter of devices that Henry recognized as energy sensors, their modern technology an intrusion against the ancient power that pulsed through the ground beneath their feet. The bear chose that moment to make its presence known, emerging from the tree line with deliberate grace. Its massive form seemed to shimmer with an inner light, the same energy that now flowed visibly between the protective stones Linda had placed. Reed's team froze, their equipment forgotten as they faced this manifestation of the mountain's power. "You see," Reed called out, though his voice had lost some of its confidence, "this is exactly what I'm talking about. A creature that defies natural law, a place where reality itself seems to bend. Think of what we could learn, what we could achieve by understanding these forces." But Henry wasn't listening to Reed's words anymore. Through his deepened connection to the mountain, he could sense the man's true intentions. The desire not to understand, but to possess, to exploit the sacred for personal gain. The wooden sculpture in his hands grew almost too hot to hold, its symbols now glowing with the same intensity as those on the cabin walls. The bear moved forward, each step leaving traces of ethereal light in the morning dew. Reed's team began to back away, their scientific certainty crumbling in the face of something their instruments could never fully measure. But Reed himself stood his ground, pulling out what looked like a modern version of the stones Linda had given Henry. "You think you're the only one who's learned the mountain's secrets?" Reed challenged, arranging his artifacts in a pattern that made the air crackle with competing energies. "There are other sources of knowledge, Professor, other ways to tap into these powers." Henry felt the mountain's response through every fiber of his being. The symbols throughout the cabin blazed to life, their light connecting with Linda's stones to form a web of pure energy around the sacred space. The bear's presence grew more magnificent, its form seeming to expand with the power of ages flowing through it. The confrontation had begun, but as Henry stepped forward to meet it, he knew this was more than a battle between individuals. It was a test of the mountain's choice, a chance to prove that its ancient wisdom had found a truly worthy guardian in the modern world. The clearing around the cabin had become an arena where two fundamentally different understandings of power clashed. Reed's modern artifacts, arranged in careful patterns, pulsed with an artificial energy that seemed to scrape against the mountain's natural rhythms. In contrast, the ancient stones Linda had given Henry sang with harmonious power, their energy flowing in perfect synchronization with the land itself. Through his bond with the bear, Henry could sense the mountain's rising response to this invasion. The very air seemed to thicken with potential, while the symbols on the cabin walls blazed with increasing intensity. The wooden sculpture in his hands had become almost translucent with inner light, its carvings shifting and flowing like living things. "You're fighting against forces you don't understand," Henry called out to Reed, who was frantically adjusting his devices as they sparked and sputtered against the mountain's growing power. "This isn't about science or discovery. It's about balance, about maintaining something sacred in a world that's forgotten the meaning of the word." Reed's response was to activate something that looked like a modern interpretation of an ancient artifact. The device hummed to life, sending out waves of energy that made the air ripple visibly. "The old ways are inefficient, Professor," he shouted over the growing wind. "Why protect power when we can harness it? Think of what humanity could achieve." But the mountain had its own answer to Reed's technology. The bear, its form now haloed in ethereal light, moved with deliberate purpose toward the intruder's equipment. Where it stepped, the ground itself seemed to pulse with ancient energy, each footfall sending ripples through Reed's carefully arranged patterns. Henry felt the power building through his connection to the mountain. The wooden sculpture grew warmer in his hands, its energy synchronizing with the pulses from Linda's protective stones. He understood now what Hayes had discovered. The mountain's power couldn't be taken or controlled, only joined with in respectful partnership. The confrontation reached its peak as Reed's equipment began to overload, unable to contain or channel the pure energy flowing through the sacred ground. The artificial lights flickered and died, while the ancient symbols throughout the clearing grew brighter, their light forming intricate patterns that spoke of ages of accumulated wisdom. Through the bear's eyes, Henry saw the truth of the moment with perfect clarity. This wasn't just about protecting the mountain from exploitation, it was about maintaining the delicate balance between the modern world and the ancient powers that still flowed through places like this. Reed's attempts to control these forces were doomed not because they were modern, but because they came from a place of greed rather than understanding. The bear's presence had become magnificent, its form somehow encompassing both its physical reality and something far more ancient and powerful. It moved through Reed's team's defenses as if they were no more substantial than morning mist. Its every movement a demonstration of the genuine power that Reed had sought to capture and control. Henry stepped forward, holding the wooden sculpture aloft. The symbol patterns throughout the clearing began to align, creating a web of light that connected the cabin, the protective stones, and the ancient energies flowing through the bear. Through this network of power, he could feel the mountain's full awareness focusing on this moment. Reed's artifacts, despite their sophisticated design, began to crack and fail as the mountain's true power manifested. The artificial lights and humming energies of his devices were overwhelmed by the pure ancient force that flowed through the land's chosen guardians. His team, finally understanding the futility of their efforts, began to back away, leaving their equipment behind. In that moment of clarity, Henry felt the full weight of his role as guardian. The mountain had chosen him not despite his modern background, but because of it. He could bridge the gap between the ancient and the contemporary, protecting these sacred powers while understanding their place in the modern world. The bear's eyes met his, and in that connection Henry saw the culmination of his journey. From a disillusioned academic seeking escape, he had become something far more significant, a guardian of ancient truths in a modern age, chosen by powers that had watched over these mountains since time immemorial. In the aftermath of the confrontation, the mountain's power settled into a new equilibrium. The clearing around the cabin glowed with residual energy, the ancient symbols pulsing gently like a heartbeat. Reed stood alone now, his team and equipment scattered, facing the reality of forces far beyond his ability to control or comprehend. The bear approached Reed with deliberate grace, its form still illuminated by the mountain's power. Through their connection, Henry could sense not anger, but a profound sadness for those who sought to possess rather than protect. The creature's presence spoke of centuries of guardianship, of wisdom that couldn't be measured by modern instruments. "I was wrong about the nature of this place," Reed admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. The man's ambitious confidence had crumbled in the face of true power, leaving behind someone who finally understood the magnitude of what he'd tried to disturb. "All this time I thought it was about unlocking secrets, about finding power that could be controlled." Henry stepped forward, the wooden sculpture now cooling in his hands, but still humming with gentle energy. "The mountain's power isn't meant to be unlocked or controlled," he explained, feeling the truth of the words resonate through his connection to the land. "It's meant to be protected, to remain as a reminder that some things in this world are beyond our grasp for a reason." Linda emerged from the tree line, drawn by the energy of the confrontation. She surveyed the scattered equipment with knowing eyes before turning to Reed. "The mountain has shown you its truth," she said softly. "The question now is what you'll do with that understanding." The bear moved to stand between Henry and Reed, its presence both protective and instructive. Through their shared consciousness, Henry could feel the mountain offering Reed a choice, not a threat, but an opportunity for transformation. The same choice, he realized, that had been offered to him when he first arrived at the cabin. Reed looked around at the glowing symbols, the scattered remains of his modern artifacts lying useless against the ancient power that permeated the clearing. "All my life I've chased power in one form or another," he confessed, "but this is something different. Something I never truly understood until now." The wooden sculpture in Henry's hands pulsed once strongly, and the symbols throughout the clearing blazed in response. The bear's form seemed to shimmer, and for a moment everyone present could see what Henry now saw regularly: the overlay of ancient power and wisdom that existed alongside the physical world. "The mountain doesn't need to be studied or documented," Henry said, feeling the truth of each word resonate through his connection to the land. "It needs to be respected, protected, and most importantly, allowed to remain mysterious. Some knowledge isn't meant to be catalogued or controlled. It's meant to be experienced and honored. Linda stepped forward, gathering her protective stones from their positions around the clearing. Each stone hummed with renewed energy, their power enhanced rather than depleted by the recent events. "The old ways and the new can coexist," she said, looking meaningfully at both men. "But only when there's respect for the balance between them." The bear's presence had shifted now, its energy softening as the immediate threat passed. Through their connection, Henry could sense its approval of how the confrontation had been resolved, not through destruction or dominance, but through understanding and transformation. Reed gathered his remaining equipment slowly, his movements those of a man coming to terms with a profound shift in his worldview. Before leaving, he turned to Henry one last time. "I came here looking for power," he said quietly. "Instead, I found something far more valuable, the understanding that some mysteries are meant to remain mysterious." As Reed's vehicle disappeared down the mountain road, Henry felt the forest releasing its held breath. The symbols on the cabin walls settled into a gentle glow, while the protective stones Linda had placed hummed with renewed purpose. The bear moved to his side, its form once again solid but still carrying that hint of ancient power that Henry had come to recognize. The days following the confrontation brought a profound peace to the mountain. Henry's transformation from disillusioned academic to guardian felt complete, though he understood that his journey of learning would never truly end. The cabin had become more than a refuge. It was now a sacred space where ancient wisdom and modern understanding could coexist in harmony. Linda visited regularly, bringing new teachings and helping Henry deepen his connection to the mountain's mysteries. The protective stones she had given him now responded to his touch with increased sensitivity, their energy harmonizing perfectly with his enhanced awareness of the sacred space he protected. The bear remained a constant presence, their bond growing stronger with each passing day. Through their shared consciousness, Henry could now access the mountain's memories with ease, understanding his place in a long line of guardians who had maintained the balance between worlds. The creature's wisdom had become an integral part of his own, guiding his actions and deepening his understanding of his role. His former life at the university seemed like a distant dream. The professional struggles and failed marriage that had driven him to seek solitude now appeared as necessary steps on his path to becoming a guardian. The mountain had called to him in his moment of crisis, offering not an escape, but a transformation. The wooden sculpture had found its permanent home on the altar, serving as a focal point for the mountain's energy. The symbols carved into its surface no longer needed interpretation. They spoke to Henry directly, their ancient messages clear in his enhanced understanding. The altar chamber had become a place of communion rather than mystery, where the physical and spiritual aspects of his guardianship merged. News of what had happened spread through subtle channels in the nearby town. Those who had known Hayes' story recognized the pattern, understanding that the mountain had chosen another protector. Local residents began leaving small offerings at the edge of the property, tokens of respect for the powers that watched over their community. One evening, as Henry sat on the cabin's porch with the bear beside him, he reflected on how completely his life had changed. The academic who had arrived seeking escape had found purpose instead. The mountain's mysteries hadn't been solved, they had been embraced, becoming part of a deeper truth that transcended ordinary understanding. Linda arrived that evening with a special gift, Hayes' original journal, which had been kept in her family's care. "You're ready for this now," she said, placing the worn volume in his hands. "Not to study it, but to continue it. Each guardian adds their own chapter to the mountain's story." As Henry opened the journal, he felt the weight of generations of guardians who had come before him. Hayes' final entry caught his eye. Not an ending, but a transition, just as his own story had become. The mountain had chosen them both, connecting their journeys across time in service of something greater than themselves. The bear's presence beside him carried a new significance now. They were partners in maintaining the sacred balance, each bringing their own strengths to the task. Through their bond, Henry could feel the mountain's satisfaction with its choice, not just of him as guardian, but of the harmony they had achieved between the ancient and the modern. As night fell, the symbols throughout the cabin began their gentle glow, a reminder of the power that flowed through this sacred space. Henry understood now that his role wasn't just to protect these mysteries from those who would exploit them, but to serve as a bridge between two worlds, maintaining the delicate balance that allowed both to exist. The mountain's voice, once so mysterious, now spoke to him clearly through every rustle of leaves, every pattern of light, every subtle shift in the forest's energy. He was no longer just an observer of these phenomena, but a part of them. His consciousness expanded to embrace both his human understanding and the ancient wisdom he now served. In the end, Henry realized that the peace he'd initially sought in solitude had found him in connection to the land, to its guardians both physical and spiritual, and to a purpose greater than himself. His transformation hadn't erased who he was, but had completed him, adding deeper layers of understanding to his academic foundation. As the stars emerged above the mountain, their light seemed to pulse in harmony with the symbols protecting the sacred space. Henry felt the truth of his journey settling into his bones. He had found not just a new life, but his true calling. The mountain had called and he had answered, becoming part of a story as old as the land itself. If you've been moved by Henry's journey from a lost soul to the guardian of the mountain, we invite you to join us for more transformative tales that bridge the ancient and modern worlds. Subscribe to our channel and activate notifications to never miss our next story of mystery and spiritual awakening. Share your own experiences of finding purpose in unexpected places in the comments below. Remember, sometimes the greatest discoveries come when we stop trying to control the mysteries and simply let them guide us. Like and follow for daily content that explores the sacred spaces still hidden in our modern world.